Our scripture today comes from the book of Exodus. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Indeed, by a mighty hand he will let them go. By a mighty hand he will drive them out of his land." The Egyptians urged the people to hasten their departure from the land, for they said, "We shall all be dead." The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. The time that the Israelites had lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, on that very day, all the companies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. That was for the Lord a night of vigil, to bring them out of the land of Egypt. That same night is a vigil to be kept for the Lord by all the Israelites throughout their generations. Here ends the reading of the word.
All right, we're going to pick back up now with our story of Moses, and I was hoping we would cover the Exodus today, and we're going to touch on it, but we're not going to be able to finish it, so we'll have to finish it next week. I just had no idea when I sit and make my preaching calendar sometimes how long it's going to take to get through something, and so I make a guess, and sometimes I'm right and sometimes I'm wrong, but I think when I spent so much time doing them to just a camera, my sermons to just a camera, it allowed, I had to make them shorter. Because they tell you it's harder for someone to listen to someone on a screen than it is in person. So now I can talk longer. And I carried y'all through 31 minutes the other day, and nobody complained, so I guess we're good. But today won't be so long. I timed it, and it's not too bad. But we are going to start talking about the Exodus, and it's really important we do because it's a very, very important story of the Israelite people. It is actually, you could say, the central story to the Israelite people, the Passover and the Exodus. This is actually the story that they repeat once a year at what they call a Seder. They actually go through the entire story, but they also have it in their liturgical prayers. So those Jews that use liturgical prayers in the morning and the evening actually still talk about the Passover and the Exodus. Jesus probably prayed about it every morning and every evening. So it's a really, really important story. And because Christianity comes out of Judaism, it's actually an important story for us too. It is part of our story. Even though we're not Jewish, we are still part of that history, part of that story, and it should matter to us as well. So let me just catch us up, since we had a little break. Remember, we had Moses, the Pharaoh, at the time Moses was a baby, was becoming very intimidated by the Israelites and the number of Israelites. And so he enacted a policy to have the firstborn child thrown into the river, the firstborn son thrown into the river. And so Moses' mother hid him, and then eventually, thanks to some quick thinking by Moses' sister Miriam, Pharaoh's daughter ends up taking him from the Nile and raising him as hers. And then at some point, Moses sees some injustice against the Israelites by an Egyptian, and he slays the Egyptian, and he ends up having to run for his life. And then he spends 40 years in the wilderness. He gets married, he has kids, probably is still thinking about the situation in Egypt with the Israelites, but is, instead of doing anything about it or recognizing that he can't do anything about it, he's now a shepherd. And then one day he comes across a burning bush. And the burning bush speaks to him, it's God, and God tells him, "I want you to go back." And that's what we talked about last week, is he went back and he warned Pharaoh over and over again. As a matter of fact, at the very beginning, he warned Pharaoh, if you don't let the people go, God will take the firstborn sons of Egypt. But Pharaoh ignored him. And after 10 plagues, we finally get to the Passover. The 10th plague is the plague of the death of the firstborn. And so God has an angel of death pass over, and those that have taken the blood of a lamb and put it on their doorpost and put it on their lintel are spared. Now, there's some ironies in this, because do you remember what kind of animal the Egyptians despised? Sheep. So how ironic it is, it's the blood of sheep that is used to save. I also have no doubt, though, that there were probably some Egyptians at this point that are now going to Moses on a regular basis, and they're asking Moses, what do we need to do? And so they had to go and get sheep to save their family. And then after the angel of death passes through and the firstborn of Egypt pass away, of course there's a huge outcry, and Pharaoh comes and says, I want you guys to go. You need to leave. And as they leave, the Egyptians start giving them things. They plunder the Egyptians on their way out. The Egyptians start giving them gold and other precious gems and minerals. And I have a feeling some of that was here's enough money to make the trip go. Some of it, though, I think was probably Thanksgiving offerings for those Egyptians that had followed the things Moses had told them to do, and that had gone and put the blood on their doorpost and realized that their firstborn was spared while their neighbors wasn't. They were probably very grateful and very thankful. And some left. We know that there were Egyptians that left with Moses and the Israelites, but there were some that didn't. And I have a feeling that some of those are the ones that gave gifts. So they give gifts to the Israelites, and the Israelites now leave. And we're told in the text that there were 600 men. And then you count women and children, or probably over 1 million people now leaving Egypt, heading into the desert, and then to Canaan. So here's what I want to talk about, because here's where we run into a problem. Archaeologists say it never happened. That there's no way that many people, one, could even move through the desert. You can't find enough water and enough food for that many people. It's just impractical. And two, they would have left some evidence behind. That many people moving through an area leaves evidence, and there is no evidence that there was any kind of migration of people out of Egypt, that number of people out of Egypt into Canaan. So I want to propose some theories for you guys. I've got these from different places, and I'm giving them to you because I know that at some point, some of you have probably already bumped into someone that said to you, hey, you know that never happened, right? And so I want you to have a good answer. So you're going to have some choices here of some answers that you're welcome to use for theories on the Exodus. First theory is it didn't happen. It is possible it never happened, and what happened instead is that the Israelites wrote a story to explain God's salvation. It's not uncommon for people, especially in ancient times, to ask the question, how did this happen? Why did this happen? Do you know where all the gods of the ancient world came from? It's from people asking the question, how did we come to be? And someone told a story, and eventually the story got shared and elaborated until it became a myth or a legend, or however you want to say it, and that became their creation story. Well, now you have all these Israelites, they believe in God, they believe in God's salvation, and they're trying to explain it to people, and so they write a story to explain God's salvation, and they use a real-life event, not a real-life event, they use an event that would make sense to people as an example of showing God's salvation. So that's one theory. It's not my favorite. So I do have a personal, I actually have two in here I like, but I won't, I'll probably tell you. All right. The second theory is it happened, and who cares what archaeologists think anyway? I'm sorry to be tongue-in-cheek, but I just couldn't help it. Archaeologists are still finding things, and we just don't know. I mean, there's kind of, I think what troubles me about us taking this stance is that we just don't want to throw all scientists out the window. We don't want to just throw all archaeologists out. I mean, we may like archaeologists. I actually subscribe to 2 archaeology magazines. I do like archaeology. But I think we need to be careful with this one. I think we can make a stance that it happened, but I think we need to be careful just saying that who cares what scientists think. So this one, I think we just need to be a little bit careful. But that is one of the theories. There are a lot of Christians that take this stance. I don't care what archaeologists think, and it happened. I think this one makes a little more sense. It happened, and archaeologists just haven't found the evidence yet. That's not uncommon. It was actually only until here recently that archaeologists proved that the House of David actually existed. They actually found a tablet in 2014 or 2016 that said House of David. Until that point, there was no proof that there was ever a House of David. Pontius Pilate. A lot of people said he never existed until they found a tablet with his name on it. So archaeologists are still finding things that prove some of the biblical people that we know about really existed. So it's possible they just simply haven't found the evidence of the fact that there were Israelites in Egypt and that they left. And I'm not surprised, actually, that there's no evidence in Egypt. And I think that's one of the things archaeologists are really struggling with. Nowhere in Egypt is there a hieroglyphic that says, oh, and the Egyptian people brought 10 plagues upon us, and then we had to shoo them out. And then they defeated our army. And I'm not surprised by that, because think about if Ramesses II was the Pharaoh, he was a very vain man. He did more building than any pharaoh ever in Egypt. And on almost everything he built, he put his picture. There are so many statues of Ramesses II, it is almost just sickening. I mean, everywhere you go, there's another one and another. He built lines of them. So you could walk through lines of statues of Ramesses II. They actually know, too, that he went to some of the monuments his dad had built, and he chiseled off his dad's name and put his name on them. Does he sound like the kind of person that's going to write a story somewhere about the time he lost the Israelites? Probably not. So it's possible that there's no evidence in Egypt because of that. The more troubling, and I do like that theory, the troubling part of that theory, though, is there's just no evidence, though, that they ever went through the desert. There's no evidence of this migration of people that left and walked through that for 40 years, actually, through the desert. So that brings us to this. It happened differently, but was retold the way we have it in Exodus. Now, the reason I think this has some plausibility is because we need to realize that in the ancient times, they told history a lot different than we did. We tell history for facts. We don't care really what the significance was of it, what the meaning was of it. We just want a list of facts, almost just a list of dates. Just give me the facts. Back then, though, what really mattered to them was the significance of an event. What did it mean and what did it do? How did it change the world? Let me give you an example. If we took this half of the room, and let's say we all watched the same event, but I took this half of the room and I told this half of the room, I want you to watch, but all I want you to do is record exactly what happened. I don't want to know what it means to you. I don't care what you felt. I just want to know what happened. But I take this half of the room, and I tell you guys, I don't need details. Just tell me how it made you feel and what was significant about it. Do you think these stories would be the same? No. And if I looked at just the stories on this side of the room, would all of these stories be the same? No. Rocky's story is going to be very different from Betty's story, because what was significant to her may not have been significant to him, and vice versa. So their story is going to be different. But what if I told this side of the room, you can only have one story? Come up with one story. You all get in a huddle and take all of that and make one story out of it. And you're going to try to hit all the highlights, everything. If it was significant to Rocky, it needs to be in there. If it was significant to Betty, it needs to be in there. So the story, which might have looked like this, is now going to look like this because something was significant to everybody, right? Everybody's going to find some part of it that was significant. So when the ancient peoples told stories, when they shared their history, that's more what they did than this. We struggle with this. We think this is wrong and incorrect. And you know what they would say? You guys missed the point. You guys missed the history. This is just a list. Tell me what difference it made in the world. What was significant about it? With that in mind, I want to share one that scholars are suggesting was possible. When they go back and look at the land of Canaan, there is a time period where there's just hardly any population there, and everything's concentrated, all the population is concentrated into what they called city-states. And this is on Nova, by the way. It's called Secrets of the Bible if you want to watch it. But all the population's concentrated in these city-states that each had their own king. And so what they started discovering, though, is over time, these kings began to tax the people. And they began to tax them quite heavily. And then they took the peoples that were around them and began to use them more as a slave labor force than what we think of as, say, a monarchy in Europe. And eventually, the people get pretty upset about this. And let me real quick just show you. This is the city of Ai, A-I. Probably seen it in some biblical texts, the city of Ai. This is a reconstruction of it. And what they discovered is that top part, and actually let me show you real quick. This is the actual site. You see all of the work being done there. This is where they're doing the archaeological digs. That's the top of the hill. You go back and look at it. So there's the top of the hill. The top of the hill was where the temple and the palace and all the nice houses were. That was the folks with a good view. Below that, they can tell that those were the people that did not have the same resources and income that the people up on the hill had. Sounds like Farmington, doesn't it? So down below was where the servant or the slave labor lived, and at the top of the hill is where all the other folks lived. Well, what happened at some point is the people got tired of it. They said, no, I don't want to do that anymore. And so they revolted against the elite, so to speak, the nobility, whatever you want to call it, the people in charge. And they destroyed the cities. After they destroyed the cities, they then moved out into the hills, away from the cities. But at the same time, they noticed a growth in population. This is what archaeologists have found. This is what the science shows in archaeology, what actually happened in Canaan. Now, that population growth is not the amount that came out of Egypt, but is a significant change. So you've got two things happening at once. You've got all these people revolting against the people that are oppressing them, and now they're tearing down those cities and moving into the hillsides. And at the same time, you've got a change in population where it increases some. So what many scholars believe happened is there were two events that happened at the same time, one being the account of Moses and the Israelites, just not in the numbers that we see in the text. So there's a group of Israelites in Egypt. They get their freedom. They do leave. They go through the desert, everything we've seen in the stories, and then they come to the land of Canaan. And when they get to the land of Canaan, they begin to share their story of how God helped them defeat the bondage of slavery. How God was with them through the desert. How God took care of them. How God took care of the people that oppressed them. or overturn the people that oppressed them. Do you think that would have resonated with the people in Canaan, who have now just defeated their kings and overthrown the oppressors in their land? The stories probably resonated. And so they believed that these two groups of people began to share one history. That as the Israelites that came out of Egypt began to tell their story, the people in Canaan began to share their story, and they decided instead to become one people group. Two people groups became one people group and shared one history. That almost gives me goosebumps when I think about it. Because when you think about today, how easy we find something to divide over. At the drop of a hat, right? At the drop of the hat, we'll say, you know what? I'm unfriending you on Facebook. We easily find reasons to split. And when we do try to come together, it almost always ends up stalling, doesn't it? Because who wins? Who gets to decide what the rules are? Who gets to decide what this union of two groups looks like? And that starts with maybe a little bickering, and then someone's feelings get hurt, and people leave, and before you know it, this attempt to become one people out of two, or one group out of two groups, falls apart. That's what we see the majority of time. But if this story is true, and I don't know that it is, I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow they don't find archaeological evidence of 1 million people moving through the desert. But what I like about this story is what we can learn from the idea of two groups coming together and choosing to share the same history. Choosing to say that your history is my history. Your story is my story. That's very powerful. About 2 years ago, I preached a sermon, and I talked about how in Africa, in one particular group in Africa, they have a word that means I am as you are. Brownie points for anybody that can remember that word. Sawubona. And that word, it's a greeting, and we don't translate it the way they mean it. We translate it, I see you. But what it means to them is that everyone in their community shares. It's one community. And so if anyone in the community is hungry, everyone is hungry because the community is hungry. If anyone in the community is cold, everyone is cold because the community is cold. What scholars are proposing is that's exactly what happened with these two groups. Is that this smaller group of Israelites came up, and they met the Canaanites, and they had a very similar story of overcoming oppression. And the Canaanites said, then God must have been with us too. And they began to share one story. So whichever theory you pick, I have two. I have two that I like. I like this one, and I like the fact they may not have found the evidence. But what I think we can walk away from this with is that we are actually all invited to share in a story. And that's the story of Christ. Christ has also won our freedom. Christ has saved us from the bondage of sin. And God says to us, you can be part of my story. In the same way that those Canaanites and the Israelites, if that really happened, the same way they bonded together and chose to be one people and have one history and therefore one story, Christ invites all of us into the same opportunity. Christ says that we can live in Him and therefore have His story. his story of the crucifixion and resurrection. We can live into his new resurrected body and his new resurrected life. That's an awesome opportunity to be part of that. So I just encourage all of us to think about the fact that our story can be one story with Christ. One story with the creator of the entire world. What an awesome opportunity. That ought to give us all goosebumps. And I know it's hard because we can hardly fathom what that means to be allowed and invited into the story of the creator, the one that loves all of us. We can all share that same history together. So I invite all of us to remember, if you've already invited Christ, you're already in that story, then just remember it today. Be thankful for it. And if you haven't, I encourage you to today to just take the freedom that's offered in Christ to be part of his story. Amen.